Miracles cannot be identified even if they exist. Depending on who you ask, you'll get a different version of what the word miracle actually is meant to mean. But it seems that the most used version of it is something that breaks the laws of the universe, a rare event that can't be summoned on demand and usually points directly to the divine. Although some events in the past have been mistaken for miracles, one can say, well, see, they weren't rare, so they weren't ever a miracle in the first place. Aurora borealis, lightning, say Elmo's fire. These are things that are, relatively speaking, common enough to not be an actual miracle. So even though somebody at some point thought that they were seeing a miracle, well, they were simply mistaken. And herein lies the first problem of identifying a miracle. How do you know if something is a rare event? And how rare does it have to be miraculous? Let's say that this exploding light dust occurs in somebody's hands, and that's it. It happens once. And then 100 years later, it happens again. Well, is it a miracle or not? Every 75 years, Halley's Comet will shoot over our heads. Is that a rare event? Well, to somebody that saw it once during their lifetime, for them it's rare, but for other people it's not rare because it's going to happen again in 75 years. So it's not a miracle because it's not rare. How do we know when something's rare? Another problem with identifying miracles is they seem to always be things that nature itself could explain. Well, here's a lovely picture I found of somebody standing up in the bright sunshine next to a wheelchair. Now, I guess we're supposed to think that they stood up from that wheelchair, but perhaps that wheelchair was just placed there later on. But let's just say that they got up from their wheelchair. Well, that's not a thing that couldn't happen by nature itself, so it's not a miracle, is it? Well, maybe he was crippled his whole life and never had walked. Does that mean it's impossible for his body to recover? If so, then he shouldn't be able to do that. And therefore, it's got to be a miracle, right? But then if we examined him, it turns out that, well, obviously he is able to have done this because he's doing it. So therefore, it can't be a miracle. Well, what about walking on water? Well, that seems rather miraculous, but there's a couple problems with this. First of all is testability. I mean, if we can just say that walking on water is a miracle, then I've got this guy, and I also have a wolf that seem to be able to perform miracles. What about somebody coming back from the dead? Well, that's got to be a miracle, but it happens. And what we mean by dead is kind of fuzzy right now in medical terminology. When is someone really actually beyond the recovery of from dead to back to not dead? And if we can pull them from one to the other, well, then that's still natural and not supernatural, isn't it? If we're using technology or medicine, then that's definitely natural. If their body does it on their own, well, that has to be natural because it's their body doing it. The reporting of miracle events is sometimes by a large number of people, unless it isn't, in which case it's by a small group of people. But isn't it odd that these people are usually devout people to a particular religion or particular belief already? In other words, they're expecting to find a miracle, so of course they're going to find a miracle. Also telling of miracle events is they're usually not well documented. Photographs and videotape of these phenomenon just don't seem to exist for some reason. Well, usually because the miracle happened sometime in the past before we had any of this technology. But if you do document it, it's usually found out later to be either a trick or just natural phenomenon. But let's just say that you were able to document something extraordinary. Let's just say that you're able to photograph and videotape this weird color thing that's happening in the atmosphere. Is this a miracle? Well, it's rare. No one's seen anything like this before. And it's untestable because it's not going to be there long enough for you to test. So, is it a miracle? I don't know. How do we know? How could we know? How could we hope to know? Well, perhaps you want to go the other route and say a miracle is life itself. Well, look at this weed sprouting through the concrete. That's a miracle. Well, I don't know that would, for me, qualify as a miracle. It's a natural event that isn't that extraordinary. But if you want to call that a miracle, then I guess everything is a miracle, which would then mean nothing really is a miracle. So, what system do we use to deduce when we've actually witnessed a miracle event? Well, we can't test it. We can't know if it's rare. So, how do we know what we saw or what other people claim to have seen is any sort of anything at all without a test? Ah, yes, but to this, the apologist has a brilliant retort. Ah, you must demand a test for all things, and you can't test history, so therefore we've got to be skeptical of history! Oh, no. No, I was asking for a test of this particular phenomenon. That doesn't mean I need a test for everything, but I certainly need some sort of system, some sort of test, some sort of something that puts this phenomenon into the category of miracle. And based on its own definition, this is completely impossible. Miracles have never been summoned on demand in a controlled laboratory environment. Well, I mean, of course not, because if you were able to do that, then you could test what they were, and then you could, if you can test them, then they're not miracles anymore. Okay, so then we should be able to have one and not be able to run any tests on it so that we wouldn't know what it was, so we couldn't rule out the possibility that it's natural, because maybe it is natural and we just don't have the machine to show that it's natural yet. So therefore it's a miracle until we find a machine that can show that it's natural, but we can't get it in the lab anyways because it doesn't work like that because of reasons. Miracles, some say, are not magic. They're not something that you can just command to happen. Why not? Well, because a greater force is in charge of them, perhaps a god or a spirit or a deity or angel or devil or demon or something. And that entity doesn't like to be tested, doesn't like to be made to do things. It will do it if and when it feels like it. But that, to me, still sounds like a magician who knows how to do a clever trick, but will only do it when they feel like it. They won't do it in a laboratory setting. They won't do it, over and over again in front of you so you can figure out how they're really doing it. They'll just only do it when it's convenient for them to do. And in a similar way, perhaps these miracle events only happen when it's convenient for people to claim that they have happened. The last thing I want you to think about before I end this video is the fact that stories are only told that are interesting. So somebody gets shot at, and the person, even though they were standing at point blank distance, somehow doesn't hit them. The bullet somehow misses them completely. And there's documentation of this. There's videos that show they're at point blank range and they pulled the trigger, and yet the bullet somehow didn't hit that person. And somebody might want to call that a miracle rather than a giant coincidence or whatever else you might want to call it. But that story is not a story if the person shoots and the bullet hits them. It only became a story because it was interesting. You don't tell the boring stories. Oh, I prayed for this thing to happen, and you know what? Nothing happened. That's not a story. It's only a story. It's only published. It only becomes widespread when it's different and unique and interesting. I was walking to the store and I picked up my groceries and then I went home. That's not very much of a story. I was walking to the store, and as I went to get my groceries, I met the love of my life, and it was a miracle. That's a story. So, the boring stories, the everyday stories, those don't get spread around. The mystical and magical stories, those do. My conclusion here, due to all of this, is even if miracles happened, we could never identify them. And the fact is that it seems more plausible that miracles are just normal events that we call miracles because it makes our stories more amazing.